We throw around the word ability so casually. Like,
Yeah.
it's a simple thing. I can tie my shoes, you can probably whistle a tune.
Right, it seems straightforward.
But then you think about, like, a gymnast sticking a perfect landing, or a musician improvising a jazz solo,
Yeah, or writing a novel.
and suddenly it's not so simple anymore.
Definitely not. There's a lot more going on beneath the surface.
That's exactly what we're diving into today, this fascinating world of abilities. To help me unpack this, I've got the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, well, abilities.
Great source, really comprehensive.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to figure out what it really means to have an ability. Philosophically speaking, of course, this is a deep dive after all.
Absolutely. We're going to explore the theories, the arguments, the whole philosophical shebang.
But don't worry, we'll keep it lively.
Yeah.
We're not going to turn this into a dry lecture.
Not a chance.
Okay, so first things first. Before we get into the theoretical weeds, we need to define our terms. What kind of things are we even talking about when we use the word ability?
Right. Got to start with the basics.
Seems obvious, but I have a feeling it's more complicated than it appears.
It definitely is. A good place to start is by looking at related concepts, like dispositions.
Dispositions, like a tendency towards something.
Exactly. The classic example is fragility. A glass has the disposition to break if dropped.
Okay, I see. It's like an inherent property.
Precisely. And importantly, that disposition exists even when it's not being actively manifested. The glass is still fragile even when it's sitting safely on a table.
So, like, my disposition to make terrible puns exists even when I'm trying to have a serious philosophical discussion.
Sure, we can go with that.
The point is, it's a potential that's always there.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But here's the thing. Dispositions aren't the only kinds of inherent possibilities. There are also affordances.
Affordances?
Yeah, think of it as the possibilities offered by an object or an environment. Like, an apple affords eating. A path affords walking.
Okay, you get it.
And even when we talk about the powers of inanimate objects, like the wind blows, the river flows, those are also a type of possibility.
So power is the big umbrella term. And under that, we have dispositions, affordances, and abilities.
Right. So now the question becomes, what makes an ability special? What sets it apart?
What makes it unique?
Two things. First, who has it? Abilities are possessed by agents, beings capable of acting intentionally.
Okay, so a rock might have the disposition to roll down a hill, but it doesn't have the ability to roll itself down the hill.
Exactly. It's not an agent, doesn't have intentions.
Gotcha. And the second thing,
The object of the ability.
abilities relate agents to actions.
Actions. So knowing French grammar isn't an ability, but speaking French is.
You got it. The focus is on what an agent can do.
Although, I'd argue that knowing grammar is a pretty crucial part of being able to speak a language. Well, sure, but philosophically we're drawing a line between states of knowledge and the capacity to act.
Fair enough.
Though even action itself is a bit of a philosophical minefield, there are borderline cases, fuzzy boundaries.
Always are.
But for our deep dive, we'll stick to the clear-cut cases to keep things manageable.
Makes sense. Now, the source also mentions active powers, things that involve the will. Is that just another way of saying ability?
Not exactly. They're definitely related, but not interchangeable. Abilities often involve the will, but not always.
Okay, give me an example.
Think about the power to will itself. That's definitely an active power. But whether willing counts as an action, philosophically speaking, is a whole other debate.
Ah, I see. It gets tricky. So active power is a related concept, but not a perfect synonym.
Right.
Now, there's another term I often use interchangeably with ability. Know-how. Knowing how to ride a bike. Knowing how to cook a decent meal.
Right, we use them in similar ways.
Are they the same thing philosophically?
Traditionally, yeah. So especially following Ryle's work. Knowing how to do something was seen as pretty much equivalent to having the ability to do it.
Makes sense intuitively.
But Stanley and Williamson challenged that assumption. They argue that knowing how might actually be a form of propositional knowledge.
Propositional knowledge, like knowing that something is the case.
Exactly. So knowing how to bake a cake might actually be knowing that a certain combination of ingredients and steps will result in a cake.
Interesting. So I could know all the theory behind baking a cake, but still be a terrible baker in practice.
That's the idea. The knowledge is there, but the ability might be lacking.
So for our deep dive, we're focusing on ability itself. And maybe that'll shed some light on the whole know-how debate down the road.
Exactly.
Okay, one more thing before we move on. The source also mentions intelligent powers,
Mm.
skills, talents, that sort of thing.
Right. Those are interesting, too.
Are they just a special category of abilities?
That's a good question, and philosophers are still debating it. Some argue for a dispositionalist account of talent, like Rob.
Meaning talents are also a kind of disposition.
Right, a disposition to acquire and refine a specific skill. McGeer talks about intelligent capacities in a similar way.
So maybe we can fit these intelligent powers into a broader framework that also includes general abilities.
Potentially, but the exact relationship between them is still an open question. Plenty to ponder there.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork, defined our terms. Now let's get to the real meat of it, the philosophical theories of ability. The source dives into two main types, hypothetical and modal theories.
The classic approaches.
Let's start with hypothetical theories. What's the basic idea behind them?
They try to define ability in terms of what you would do if you had a certain volition, if you wanted to do something or intended to do it.
Okay, so it's about hypotheticals. If this, then that.
Right. And the most famous hypothetical theory is the conditional analysis.
Conditional analysis. Sounds a bit technical.
It is, but the idea is simple. It says S has the ability to A if and only if S would A, if S tried to A.
If I tried to do something and I would succeed, then I have the ability to do it.
Exactly. It's about exploring those what-if scenarios.
And the source points out that this would is a subjunctive conditional. We're talking about counterfactuals here, not just what actually happens.
Right. We're going beyond the actual world, considering possibilities.
And what's the main goal of this conditional analysis?
To explain ability without referring back to ability itself, to break it down into more basic concepts.
So no circular definitions.
Exactly. And, it does have a certain intuitive appeal. If I try to lift this book and I succeed, it seems reasonable to say I have the ability to lift it.
Yeah, I can see that. And even Hume, when he talked about liberty, seemed to be hinting at something similar. He said it's the power to act or not act according to the will.
Right. That's very much in line with the conditional analysis. If you choose to move, you can move. If you choose to stay still, you can stay still.
But the source warns us not to conflate this with the whole debate about free will. We're focusing on the concept of ability itself for now.
Keeping it specific.
Okay, so the conditional analysis seems plausible at first glance. But where do the problems start?
Well, there are counterexamples. Cases where the conditional analysis seems to get things wrong.
Cases where it leads to weird conclusions.
Exactly. And these counterexamples challenge both the sufficiency and the necessity of the conditional analysis.
Meaning, sometimes it seems like the analysis is too broad, and sometimes it seems too narrow.
You got it. Let's start with the sufficiency challenges. Cases where the conditional might be true, but the person still doesn't seem to have the ability.
Okay, walk me through it.
These challenges often focus on the question of whether someone could even try to do something. And there are two main types, global and local.
Global and local, what's the difference?
Global counterexamples bring in the whole issue of determinism.
Ah, the big D.
If determinism is true, some argue, then nobody actually has the ability to do anything other than what they already do.
Because everything is predetermined.
Exactly. But the conditional analysis seems to say that we would still have abilities to do otherwise, even if we never actually exercise them.
Because if I tried, part of the conditional could still be true, even in a deterministic universe.
Exactly. So if determinism is true, the conditional analysis seems to be wrong.
But wouldn't a supporter of the conditional analysis just say that determinism doesn't rule out abilities? That we can still have them, even if our choices are predetermined?
They probably would. And that's why these global counterexamples are often considered dialectically ineffective. They depend on a prior commitment to determinism, which the conditional analysis folks might not share.
Okay, fair enough. So let's move on to the local counterexamples. What are those about?
These are challenges that don't rely on the whole determinism debate. They try to show problems with the conditional analysis more directly.
Give me a concrete example.
Lehrer's candy example is a classic one. Imagine someone who has a really strong aversion to red candy.
Like a phobia or something.
Yeah, something like that. They find it absolutely repulsive. Now, it's logically possible that if they were to try to eat the candy, they would succeed. They could physically do it.
So the conditional analysis would say they have the ability to eat red candy.
Right. But their aversion is so powerful that they can't even bring themselves to try. So intuitively, they don't really have that ability.
It's like a psychological barrier.
Exactly. And the conditional analysis in its basic form doesn't account for that. It only focuses on what would happen if they tried, not on whether they could even try in the first place.
So internal psychological states can mess things up.
They definitely can. And that poses a problem for the simple conditional analysis.
The source mentions that some philosophers have tried to address this by distinguishing between psychological and non-psychological abilities.
Right, Alberton proposed that. Maybe the conditional analysis is only meant to apply to abilities that aren't hindered by psychological factors.
So my ability to lift a book would count, but my inability to eat red candy due to my phobia wouldn't.
Exactly. But the problem is, our everyday concept of ability seems to include both. If I say I can't eat red candy, I don't usually mean that I lack the physical capacity. I mean, I can't bring myself to do it.
Right, it's a psychological can't.
So the distinction might not fully solve the problem.
Okay, so we've seen the challenges to the sufficiency of the conditional analysis. What about the necessity challenges?
Those are interesting too. They focus on cases where someone seems to have an ability, but the conditional analysis would say they don't.
I'm intrigued. Give me an example.
Imagine a really good golfer who misses an easy putt. They tried to make it and they failed. So the statement they would have made it if they had tried is false.
Because they did try and they missed.
Exactly. But they're a skilled golfer, so we'd still say they had the ability to make that putt.
It was just a fluke.
Right. So in this case, the ability seems to exist, but the conditional analysis wouldn't capture it.
So again, the analysis seems to be too narrow.
It seems so.
The source mentions that a supporter of the conditional analysis might appeal to the distinction between general and specific abilities here.
They might say that the analysis is really about specific abilities, the ability to succeed in a particular situation.
So the golfer had the general ability to putt, but in that specific instance, they lacked the specific ability to make that particular putt.
Precisely. That's one way to try to defend the conditional analysis.
Okay, so the basic conditional analysis has some issues. What about the variations on that theme? The source talks about Davidson and Peacock trying to fix things.
Right. They tried to refine the conditional analysis.
What did Davidson do?
He was particularly concerned with that, but could they even try?
Problem.
The psychological barrier issue.
Exactly. So he proposed a modified conditional analysis where the antecedent didn't include any verbs of action, no trying involved.
Interesting. How did he do that?
He said that S can do X intentionally, means if S has desires and beliefs that rationalize X, then S does X.
Okay, bring that down for me. Basically, if you have the right desires and beliefs that would make it rational to do something, then you can do it intentionally.
So if I want to eat a cookie, and I believe that eating this particular cookie will satisfy that desire, then I can intentionally eat the cookie.
That's the gist of it. No mention of trying anywhere.
But the source points out that Lara's candy case still poses a problem.
It does, because even if the person could hypothetically have the desire to eat red candy, their aversion prevents them from actually having that desire.
So they can't even form the intention.
Exactly. The psychological barrier is still there, blocking the whole chain of events.
So Davidson's modification doesn't quite fix the issue. What about Peacock?
He took a different approach. Instead of modifying the antecedent, he added a supplemental condition.
Okay, what was the condition?
He said that the possibility of the person trying to do the action must be a close possibility, something we can reasonably rely on.
What does close mean in this context?
He used the example of toxic fumes in a train car. The possibility of opening a window might not be close if you're already incapacitated by the fumes.
You can't even try because you're already passed out.
Right. So in the candy case, Peacock might say that the possibility of trying to eat the candy isn't close because of the person's strong aversion.
So his modified conditional analysis avoids the counterexample.
In that specific case, yes. But the source then presents a modified Lehrer-style case to challenge Peacock.
Oh, what is it?
Imagine someone who has temporary mood-based aversions. They might be fine with red candy most of the time, but sometimes they just can't stand it.
So they satisfy the basic conditional analysis, and the possibility of trying might still be close because the aversion is temporary.
Right, but we'd still say they lack the ability in that specific moment when the aversion is active.
So even Peacock's modification might not fully capture our intuitive understanding of ability.
It seems so. It's like trying to patch up a leaky bucket. You might fix one hole, but another one always pops up.
The source makes a comparison to the Gettier problem in epistemology, trying to fix a flawed definition by adding more and more conditions.
Exactly. And as we've seen, it doesn't always work.
Okay, so hypothetical theories, while initially promising, seem to have some serious limitations. What's the main alternative?
Modal theories.
Modal theories. What's the core idea behind those?
They approach ability from a different angle. They say that ability claims are really about possibility, what an agent could do in some possible world.
Possible worlds, like alternative realities.
Exactly, different ways things could be. And the modal analysis says that an agent has an ability if and only if they perform that action in some possible world that meets certain conditions.
So instead of focusing on what someone would do if they tried, modal theories look at what they could do across a range of possibilities.
Precisely. But it's not just any kind of possibility. It has to be a restricted sense of possibility.
What do you mean?
Well, it's metaphysically possible that I could suddenly develop the ability to fly.
If pigs could fly.
But that doesn't mean I currently have that ability.
Right, that's just a wild possibility.
So modal theories have to specify what those conditions are that make a possibility relevant for ability.
So the modal analysis is a kind of template, and different theories fill in the blanks differently.
Exactly. They specify the conditions and how many possible worlds we need to consider.
And the source makes a point of saying that modal here refers to the technical framework of possible worlds, not just the general idea of possibility.
Right. It's a specific philosophical tool.
Interestingly, the source also points out that the conditional analysis itself can be seen as a kind of modal analysis.
Really?
If you analyze subjunctive conditionals using possible world semantics, the if I tried part basically becomes a condition on the possible worlds we're considering. So it's like the conditional analysis is a specific way of using the modal framework.
That's a good way to put it. It's not entirely separate from modal thinking.
Okay, so we've got this modal framework, but are there any problems with it?
Of course. There always are.
Sure.
There are both logical and linguistic challenges to the modal analysis.
Let's start with the logical ones.
Kenny raised some famous objections. He argued that if ability is just a kind of possibility, then it should follow the rules of modal logic.
Modal logic.
It's a system of logic that deals with possibility and necessity. And Kenny argued that our intuitive... One principle says that if something is actually the case, then it's possible. So if an agent actually performs an action, then they have the ability to perform that action.
Seems reasonable.
But Kenny presented a counterexample. The unskilled darts player who, through sheer luck, hits the bullseye. They perform the action, but we wouldn't say they have the ability to hit the bullseye.
Right, it was just a fluke.
Exactly. So the modal analysis, if it follows standard modal logic, seems to get that case wrong.
So our intuitive notion of ability doesn't quite line up with the logic of possibility.
That's the challenge.
What was Kenny's second objection?
It involved the distribution of possibility over disjunction. Basically, if it's possible that either A or B occurs, then it's possible that A occurs, or it's possible that B occurs.
Okay, I think I follow.
Now apply that to abilities. If you have the ability to do A or B, then you have the ability to do A, or you have the ability to do B.
Sounds right.
But Kenny gave a counterexample. Picking a card that's either red or black from a deck. You have the ability to do that.
Ours.
But it doesn't necessarily follow that you have the ability to pick a red card on request or a black card on request.
I see. It's like I can choose one or the other, but I can't control which one I get.
Exactly. And that creates a problem for the modal analysis if it relies on single possible worlds.
Because in any given possible world, you either pick red or black.
Yeah.
So the analysis would say you have one of those abilities specifically.
Precisely.
The source mentions some ways to try to address this, like Brown's idea of looking at sets of possible worlds instead of just one.
Right, that's one approach. Or you could go back to hypothetical theories and see if the logic of disjunction works differently there.
So maybe there are ways to save the modal analysis.
Potentially. But it might require some tweaking.
Okay, so we've seen the logical challenges. What about the linguistic ones?
These focus on how we actually use words like can and able to in everyday language. And the main objection here is that the modal analysis seems to blur the line between ability and mere possibility.
How so?
Take that unskilled darts player again. They might say, I am able to hit the bullseye, but intuitively that feels false.
Because they just got lucky once.
Right. But according to Kratzer's semantics, if there's any possible world where they hit the bullseye, then the sentence, I am able to hit the bullseye, would be true.
Even if it's a super improbable world.
Exactly. So the modal analysis seems to lack the resources to distinguish between genuine ability and just something being possible, however unlikely.
It doesn't capture the skill or agency involved.
Right. And the source mentions other problems too, like compulsion modals, cannot but tell the truth, and actuality entailment.
Okay, so both hypothetical and modal theories have their issues. What are the new approaches to ability that the source talks about?
These are attempts to move beyond the traditional frameworks and find new ways to think about ability.
Driven by the problems we've discussed.
Exactly. They're trying to find a more satisfying account.
The first new approach is new dispositionalism. That sounds like it's going back to dispositions, but with a new skin.
It is. Thinkers like Smith, Vivelin, and Farah are returning to dispositions, but with a more sophisticated understanding.
How so?
They recognize that the conditional analysis of dispositions itself has problems, so they're not trying to define ability directly in terms of a conditional.
Okay, remind me what the problems with the conditional analysis of dispositions are.
There are issues like thinking and masking.
Thinking and masking, those sound intriguing.
Thinking is when an object has a disposition to manifest a property, but something changes its properties right before the trigger occurs.
Like a fragile glass that suddenly turns into steel right before you hit it with a hammer.
Exactly. And masking is when the disposition is still there, but something prevents it from manifesting.
Like if the glass is wrapped in bubble wrap.
Precisely. So these cases show that the simple conditional if triggered, then manifestation doesn't always capture the reality of dispositions.
And the new dispositionalists are applying this insight to abilities.
Right. They're saying that abilities are grounded in dispositions, but they're not defining abilities through a simple conditional analysis.
So how do they define abilities then?
Farah, for example, says that an agent has an ability if and only if they have a disposition to perform the action when they try to do it.
So it's still a hypothetical account, but the core concept is the disposition, not the conditional itself.
That's the key difference.
But does this new approach avoid the sufficiency problems we saw before?
That's still an open question. Philosophers are debating it.
One of the motivations behind new dispositionalism seems to be its implications for the free will debate, specifically Frankfurt cases.
Definitely. New dispositionalists argue that in a Frankfurt case, the agent still has the disposition to do otherwise, even if it's masked by the intervener.
So they would say the person still has the ability to do otherwise, even if they never actually would.
Exactly, which challenges Frankfurt's conclusion against the principle of alternative possibilities.
But the source brings up Clark's objection. He worries that this might be changing the subject.
Right, Clark says that the relevant sense of ability for free will is about what's up to me. And if an intervener would prevent me from doing something, it doesn't feel like it's really up to me anymore.
Even if I technically have the disposition.
Exactly. It's a question of control and agency.
And the source suggests that the new dispositionalists might respond by appealing to the general-specific distinction again.
They could say that the agent lacks the specific ability to do otherwise in that particular situation, but they still have the general ability.
But then we're back to the question of whether PIP should be understood in terms of general or specific abilities.
Right, that's a crucial question for the whole free will debate.
So new dispositionalism offers a new perspective, but it doesn't settle everything.
Philosophy rarely does.
Okay, what's the other new approach? Abilities as distinctive powers.
This one moves away from dispositions and looks at other kinds of powers.
What kinds of powers?
Vetter, for example, focuses on monadic potentiality, the idea that something simply has the potential to be a certain way, independent of any triggers.
So instead of a fragile glass that breaks when dropped, it's just something that has the potential to be broken.
Exactly. And Vetter thinks this is a better way to understand abilities.
Because abilities aren't always tied to specific triggers.
Right. It's about an agent's inherent potential to perform an action. And she even proposes a new semantics for modal language based on potentiality.
So she's going beyond possible worlds.
She is. It's a pretty radical departure.
What about Stewart? What kind of power does she focus on?
She emphasizes two-way powers, the idea that agents can choose to exercise a power or not, even with all prior conditions fixed.
So unlike a glass that has to break if dropped, I can choose whether or not to lift my hand.
Precisely. And she sees this capacity for choice as the hallmark of agency.
So for Stewart, the ability to do otherwise is built into the very concept of agency.
That's her view. And it has interesting implications for the free will debate.
How so?
Well, it suggests that determinism might be incompatible with genuine agency. If everything is predetermined, then we don't really have those two-way powers.
So Stewart would be an incompatibilist.
Right. And the source points out that these three power-based approaches differ in how they view possible worlds and determinism.
New dispositionalism is generally okay with possible worlds and often leans towards compatibilism.
Vetter rejects possible worlds and is neutral on determinism.
And Stewart is also neutral on possible worlds, but defends incompatibilism.
That's a good summary.
Okay, before we move on to free will, the source mentions some other approaches that don't focus on powers. What are those?
Some philosophers are trying to refine the conditional analysis without relying on powers, like Mendel Kern's idea of practically available actions.
Practically available actions.
It's a way to focus on the actions that an agent can actually perform, given their circumstances and psychological state.
So it's trying to make the conditional analysis more realistic.
Exactly. And Jastrow proposes analyzing abilities in terms of the proportion of successful intended actions.
So if I generally succeed when I try to do something, then I have that ability.
That's the basic idea, and there are also primitivist proposals, like Mayer's, that take specific abilities as fundamental.
So the ability to perform a specific action in a specific situation is the basic building block.
Right, and general abilities are then defined in terms of those specific ones.
So lots of different approaches, no easy answers.
That's philosophy for you.
Okay, let's move on to the final part of the source. Abilities and the free will debate. Why is all this stuff about abilities relevant to free will?
Well, claims about abilities are central to a lot of arguments about free will, especially the debate between compatibilism and incompatibilism.
Remind me what those terms mean again.
Compatibilism is the view that free will is compatible with determinism. Incompatibilism is the view that they're not compatible.
So compatibilists think we can have free will even if our actions are predetermined.
Exactly. And historically, compatibilists have often appealed to theories of ability to defend their position.
Like the conditional analysis or dispositionalism.
Right. If you can analyze ability in a way that's compatible with determinism, then that seems to support compatibilism.
But the source points out a potential problem with this strategy.
What's that?
Just because you can come up with an analysis of ability that works with determinism doesn't automatically prove that compatibilism is true.
Right. The analysis itself is a premise in the argument, and that premise needs to be defended.
So compatibilists can't just define their way out of the problem.
Exactly. Van Inwagen makes this point very forcefully. He says that if incompatibilists have already presented strong arguments, compatibilists can't just ignore them.
They have to actually engage with those arguments.
Exactly.
And the source highlights some other challenges for compatibilists who rely on theories of ability.
Like what?
It's hard to find a theory of ability that's both comprehensive and avoids all counterexamples. And even if you find one, you still have to defend it against the incompatibilists.
Right. It's an ongoing battle.
Plus, there's the risk that your theory of ability might clash with our intuitions about what it means to be able to do something.
Like Clarke's objection to new dispositionalism.
Exactly. It seems like trying to settle the free will debate by first settling on a theory of ability might be putting the cart before the horse.
The source suggests that a theory of ability might be more useful for a kind of modest compatibilism.
Honest compatibilism.
It's the idea that you might be able to understand for yourself how free will and determinism could be compatible, even if you can't definitively prove it to everyone.
So it's more about personal understanding than winning a philosophical debate.
Right.
The source concludes by suggesting that we might make more progress on understanding ability if we set aside the free will debate for a while.
That's an interesting thought.
Maybe we should focus on ability itself first, figure out what it really is, and then see how that connects to free will later on.
It's a sensible approach. Ability is a complex topic in its own right.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive. We've seen how something as seemingly simple as ability can lead to all sorts of philosophical puzzles.
It's amazing how much depth there is to these everyday concepts.
The main takeaway for me is just how many different ways there are to think about ability, and how these different theories connect to broader debates about possibility, agency, and even free will.
It shows how interconnected philosophy is. You can't really isolate one concept from all the others.
So listener, as you go about your day, think about the word ability. What does it mean to you? Does it involve internal states, like desires and dispositions? Or is it more about external possibilities and opportunities? How does your understanding of ability fit into your own views on free will and responsibility? There's a lot to ponder here, and this deep dive has only scratched the surface.